Let's talk about populism. What is populism and why does it matter? It's a topic that has become quite popular, no pun intended, in comparative politics over the past 20 years or so. And it's a topic that has entered the mainstream consciousness over the past 4 years or so. And we'll talk about that. So populist comes from the Latin, populism comes from the Latin word for people. That word is populus. This might call to mind another word that we use a lot in political science, which is democracy. Democracy comes from the Greek word for the common people or the district, which is the word demos. So given that both of these words in English, populism and democracy, come from roots that basically mean the people, it would seem like these two ideas go together. Democracy and populism would be compatible. But if you've heard the term populism used in news articles or academic articles, you know that it has a bit of a negative connotation and that many scholars frame it as being incompatible with democracy. So that seems a bit counterintuitive, and we're going to explore why populism has a bad reputation. So we need to start with a little history, and we need to go back in time to the late 1800s in the United States. So there was a phenomenon called the populist movement that occurred in the USA in the 1890s. It was primarily a movement of farmers. As a result of this movement, there was actually a political party called the People's Party, or sometimes it is also called the Populist Party. It was founded in 1892 and then eventually dissolved in 1909. So it was a kind of short-lived political party that stood as a pretty substantial and significant third-party option to the traditional Republicans and Democrats. The most prominent historical figure associated with the populist movement and the People's Party is William Jennings Bryan, and that's his picture on the slide. So what did the populists want? They wanted more power for farmers and less power for bankers and commercial interests. They wanted the nationalization of the railroads. At this time in history, the owners of the railroads would engage in sort of unscrupulous practices. For example, they would increase the price to transport your grain on the railroad right around harvest time. So, normally it costs X, cents to transport this amount of grain, but then during harvest time, they increase it by 10 times or something. So farmers were upset about this and wanted the railroads to be nationalized so they could transport their crops to market in a fair way. Less immigration. So populists saw immigrants as sort of, to use a more modern phrase, as stealing jobs. They believed that that immigrants were filling jobs that native-born Americans should be taking. And now I'll go over a few more things they wanted, and these are things that they actually achieved. So the first three are a little bit nebulous and were never really achieved, but the next few were achieved in some measure during the time of the Populist Party. So the next thing they advocated for is more direct democracy. This included things like referendums, or referenda, if you use the Latin plural, which is basically where if enough people in a state sign a petition, the whole state is then forced to vote on a possible law. And if the state approves that law, it becomes a law. So it's sort of like an alternative way to legislate that circumvents the legislature. So allowing the people to directly legislate through a referendum. This was achieved in certain states. So quite a few states have referenda allowed as part of their state government process. Michigan is one of those states, and it's actually been in the news recently if you've heard about the Unlock Michigan campaign, which is basically trying to strip Governor Whitmer of her emergency powers. This is a referendum. It is still in the stage of collecting signatures, and there is some skepticism about whether all the signatures are real. And so I think it's unlikely that well, actually, I know it's unlikely, we're not going to vote on this particular referendum in Michigan, because also the Supreme Court of Michigan ended up doing what the referendum was going to do. So it's a bit legally complicated, but the point is that Michigan is one of the states that does allow citizens to legislate through referenda. Another thing they advocated, and this is one of the most famous stances of the Populist Party or People's Party, is bimetallism, or kind of the more even extreme version of that is fiat money. So at that time in US history, American money was backed by gold. So the US Treasury was required to keep in stock a certain amount of gold to back the value of the US dollar. Farmers in particular were not happy about this and wanted there to be more money available. And so they advocated for the use of silver as well as gold to back US dollars. And so that became known as bimetallism, so two metals, silver and gold, not just gold. This was a really big issue in the presidential campaign between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley. William McKinley was in favor of the gold standard. William Jennings Bryan, as part of the People's Party, was advocating bimetallism. Fiat money is even a step further. Fiat money is where there's no metal or precious item backing the money at all. Fiat means faith, and so it's the idea that we're just taking the government at its faith that our money is worth what it's worth. These policies were achieved over time. So during the time of the People's Party, there were something called silver certificates, which was a form of money that was backed by silver. So there was some degree of bimetallism achieved in that time period. And then eventually fiat money became a thing, but that was not until 1971. So the Nixon shock of 1971 got rid of Bretton Woods, essentially. And you can kind of Google Bretton Woods if you're curious about this kind of monetary policy. And it resulted in the establishment of fiat money pretty much globally. Certainly among all the Western powers, we now have free-floating currencies with exchange rates, and you're taking the government at faith that the money is worth what it's worth. There's no silver or gold backing all US dollars anymore. One more thing that they advocated for was a progressive tax system or an income tax system, and this was absolutely achieved by the creation of ratification of the 16th Amendment in 1909, and the 16th Amendment gives Congress the power to impose an income tax. So prior to this, the main way that the US government made money was through tariffs, which was difficult for farmers, and it affected farmers disproportionately. It didn't affect industrialists, bankers, capital owners very much. And so they wanted an income tax to be established so that bankers had to pay tax too, essentially, even if they weren't importing anything and therefore didn't have to pay any tariffs. By establishing an income tax, they would still have to pay some kind of tax. One thing I want to point out is that within this platform, there are elements that we may label as more leftist, and there are elements that we may label as more right wing. So, for example, the second bullet, nationalization of the railroads, that is a very left-wing idea, almost socialist in nature. But then the next bullet, less immigration, we tend to associate that more with right-wing politics. Same perhaps with direct democracy. But then a progressive tax system is more of a left-wing policy. So that's something I want you to take away from this presentation on populism, is that it is sort of a chameleon. It can't easily be labeled as left-wing or right-wing. It has elements of both. So just as a kind of fun fact, there has been some analysis by a historian, Henry Littlefield. I believe he wrote this analysis in 1964, and it was a historical literary analysis of The Wizard of Oz, written by L. Frank Baum. And basically, Littlefield argued that this book was a parable about populism. And so some of the symbolism that Littlefield pointed out, the first thing was Dorothy's silver slippers. Now, in the film version, her slippers are ruby red, but in the original book, she wears silver slippers. And Littlefield argued that this Dorothy represented the average American who wanted bimetallism. So she wears silver slippers because she's in favor of backing the US currency with silver. And she walks on the yellow brick road, symbolizing the gold standard. And then in Littlefield's analysis, the Emerald City represents Washington, D.C. Another aspect of symbolism was the Cowardly Lion. Littlefield argued that he represented William Jennings Bryan, who ultimately lost the presidential election to McKinley. So kind of a failure of the Populist Party. And then the Scarecrow and the Tin Woodman characters. According to Littlefield, the Scarecrow and Tin Woodman represent kind of the two big groups that supported the Populist Party. So the Scarecrow is the farmer, and farmers were the bulk of people who supported the People's Party. And the Tin Woodman is a factory worker, although it wasn't as many factory workers who supported the People's Party, there was still a large number of factory workers who did support the People's Party as kind of a protection against the bosses, the industrialists, the bankers. So this is something that may be somewhat of a debate, but I think it's a very interesting interpretation of The Wizard of Oz. So now let's turn more to modern times. So far we've been talking about the 1890s, but if you search the definition of populism on Google and you look at Google's little fun graph that shows when the term populism is mentioned in texts, you notice that it's mentioned more and more starting in 1900. And it has its most mentions kind of in modern times. And although Google may not have a lot of texts from the 1800s, it's hardly mentioned at all according to this graph. So that suggests that there's a kind of a different meaning of the word populism, because in the 1890s, it's hardly used, maybe a tiny bit, but we see it used much more in modern times. So how can a term that comes from the 1890s that, is kind of an obscure historical footnote be so popular in modern times? You also, if you look at the Google Trends, so this is kind of how often people Google the word populism, you see a huge spike around 2016. And this is not a coincidence. So popular interest in the idea of populism increased dramatically in 2016 due to two events, the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. And so that's what this huge spike is. Suddenly everyone's writing, thinking about, and Googling populism. So let's talk about what populism has come to mean now. This is from Encyclopedia Britannica, and I've highlighted some key elements I want you to pay attention to. So Encyclopedia Britannica says that in its contemporary understanding, populism is most often associated with an authoritarian form of politics. Populist politics, following this definition, revolves around a charismatic leader who appeals to and claims to embody the will of the people in order to consolidate his own power. In this personalized form of politics, political parties lose their importance, and elections serve to confirm the leader's authority rather than to reflect the different allegiances of the people. Some forms of authoritarian populism have been characterized by extreme nationalism, racism, conspiracy mongering, and scapegoating of marginalized groups, each of which serves to consolidate the leader's power, to distract public attention from the leader's failures, or to conceal from the people the nature of the leader's rule or the real causes of economic or social problems. So this more modern definition of populism is extremely negative. Notice terms like authoritarian, racism, and scapegoating of marginalized groups. And then also notice that this is sort of a pre-modern form of politics. So things like a charismatic leader and personalized politics, these harken back to Talcott Parsons' typology. These are pre-modern characteristics. So I think the question that we need to ask ourselves is basically, if we accept this kind of negative definition of populism, is populism compatible with democracy? And journalist Fareed Zakaria wrote a great piece called The Rise of Illiberal Democracies in Foreign Affairs in 1997. And at the beginning of the article, he quotes American diplomat Richard Holbrooke. And Holbrooke made this statement where he said, "Suppose we have a free and fair election, but the people who are elected are racists, fascists, separatists, and are publicly opposed to democracy or peace. That's the dilemma. So what do we do if the people elect candidates who are against democracy? So the democratic system sort of starts to work against itself. That's what we're thinking about here. So in order to start to dissect these questions, I think it's helpful to take a slightly more academic approach. So although the sort of popular understanding of populism is quite negative, and that's how people tend to use it, by dissecting the concept a little bit more, we can think about things in a more nuanced way and help to strip the connotation, the negative connotation away, and examine like whether that negative connotation needs to inherently be part of the concept of populism, or whether we can have an idea of populism that is more neutral. And so in order to do that, we're going to turn to Cas Mude. Mude is a Dutch political scientist. I think he works at the University of Georgia right now. He is very famous, and he is basically the world's leading expert on populism. So what does Mude say about populism? He defines populism as an ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups. These two groups are the pure people and the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. And Mude says that there are kind of 4 key elements of this definition, and I have highlighted those. So the first key element is that it is an ideology. Populism is an ideology. Second key element is the concept of the pure people. So we have this, the people, the nation, the common people who are pure and innocent and have lots of sort of common wisdom to bring to politics. Then third key element, the corrupt elite. So those career politicians, the highly educated people who are out of touch and sort of run the country without consulting, without knowing the daily lives of other people. And then fourth key element, the general will of the people. And Muda emphasizes that populism can be both left-wing or right-wing. So sometimes populism combines with socialism, creating a sort of left-wing populism, and this is very common in Latin America. Other times populism combines with a more right-wing philosophy like neoliberalism or nationalism, and this is much more common in Europe. And if you want to learn more about populism, I definitely recommend the article that this is cited from. So if you look down at the bottom of the screen, the Oxford Handbook of Populism, and then Muda has an article within that called Populism, an Ideational Approach. It's not a terribly difficult read, and if this is a topic you're interested, it's very useful. So let's think about some examples of these elements. So remember, the 4 elements are populism is an ideology, it involves the pure people, it involves a corrupt elite, and it involves kind of an expression of the general will of the people. So let's start with this picture from Donald Trump's presidential campaign in 2016. Drain the swamp is a very classic expression of the corrupt elite. So get these corrupt politicians out of Washington, lock her up. You see another sign there. So the idea of the corrupt elite was very evident in that campaign. Another very studied classic example of populism is the Syriza party in Greece. So this is one of their debates, and the slogan in the upper right-hand corner of the sign translates to, "We fight, we persist, we can." It may not seem populist at first, but I think the emphasis over and over again of we, who's we? We the people, we the common Greek people. And Syriza is one of the most famous and kind of one of the early populist parties that emerged in Europe, kind of that prompted the more recent interest in populism. Finally, an example from Latin America. So the sign in the back here translates to force and essence of a rebellious people. So notice the reference to the people, the rebellious people. And this is a poster of Hugo Chavez from Venezuela. He is deceased, but he has been replaced by another candidate, Nicolas Maduro, who's the one standing in front. And so this party, combining socialism with populism, has been very successful in Venezuela, of course, with some manipulation of the political system going on as well. So that gives kind of an intro to the topic of populism and how it has arisen in modern times. Here are some questions to think about as you mull over this topic going forward. And some of these will be reflected in our discussion this week. So first question, given that populism has been used to describe both right-wing and left-wing political movements all across the world, is it really a useful term? Or is it an oversimplification or reduction of many different political phenomena? Another question, populism has become a politically charged term that stirs up associations of racism and nativism. But if the majority of people in a country support these candidates or parties, should the will of the people be ignored? Is populism really a bad thing? Why or why not? And this is kind of getting at the interplay between democracy and populism. And then finally, one feature of populism is an emphasis on the wisdom of the common people rather than that of career politicians or political elites. Are political elites necessary in a successful democracy? Why or why not? So I'd encourage you to think about these questions and contribute to the discussion this week.